Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's my pleasure as president to welcome you here to Elmhurst College for the sixth in our year-long series of lectures addressing the topic of education in crisis. I think truly there couldn't be a more significant subject for higher education to debate. Our lecture series is bringing some of the country's brightest minds to our campus to offer their thoughts on questions like what makes school work, what reforms have worked and which have fallen flat, how ready are our schools to educate children with special cognitive and affective needs, and why are boys more likely to struggle in school? What's the future of massive open online courses, and what do they mean for traditional on-ground colleges and universities like ours? To begin our presentation this evening, Dr. Judy Feeney of our faculty will introduce our speaker. Dr. Feeney has taught grades 4 through 6 and has served as an assistant principal in an elementary school. Her doctorate is in reading and language, and her specialty is reading development, specifically reading comprehension and classroom instruction. Dr. Feeney's current scholarship focuses on reading in the content area and understanding how additional courses in reading instruction at the undergraduate level may impact a novice teacher's pedagogy. Her service includes a partnership with the college's Niebuhr Center for Faith in Action, where she coordinates efforts to provide summer literacy instruction for K-8 Latino students. Please welcome Dr. Judy Feeney.
Good evening. I have the privilege of introducing Peg Tyre, a nationally renowned writer and thinker about education. Peg is the author of the influential and widely praised books, The Good School, How Smart Parents Get Their Kids the Education They Deserve, and The Trouble with Boys, a surprising report card on our sons, their problems at school, and what parents and educators must do, which became a New York Times bestseller and won the prestigious Books for a Better Life Award in 2009. Peg specializes in making complicated education research and thorny policy questions around schooling accessible to parents, the most passionate and motivated stakeholders in the national debate about education reform, and the ones who are most often ignored. Peg spent 2 decades in journalism, writing cover stories for Newsweek and features and analysis for the New York Times. At the start of her career as a newspaper reporter, she was part of a group of reporters who won a Pulitzer Prize. She was twice nominated for a National Magazine Award, the magazine industry equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize. She was also honored by the Education Writers Association. She has written for or been written about in U.S. Today, The Wall Street Journal, Reuters, CNN.com, Time.com, People Magazine, U.S. News and World Report, and The Washington Post. In 2009, she was awarded a Spencer Research Fellowship at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. In 2011, she co-taught the Covering Education course there. She has discussed her ideas on the Today Show, Good Morning America, Fox and Friends, Anderson Cooper, and NPR. She has lectured at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and the Googleplex in Mountain View, California. She has given the keynote address at national education events and spoken at corporate conferences. She is frequently asked to conduct teacher training at public and private schools around the nation and provide workshops to parents on education issues. She lives in Brooklyn, New York with her husband, novelist and television writer, Peter Blunner, and their 2 sons. It's my privilege to introduce my new friend, Peg Tyre.
Thank you very much for inviting me here to address your learning community. It's a true pleasure to be here, and I get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is boys in school. I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book. I wasn't looking to write about boys. I am a former girl. And I grew up in the time when girls were really trying to get become strong members of the education communities themselves. I grew up on the literature of reviving Ophelia and how schools, that report from the American Association of University Women, how schools shortchange girls. And so when I became an education reporter, I went into schools all the time, all kinds of schools all over the country, and I really did look at girls mostly. I understood that they suffered a perilous passage in middle school and lost their voice and really struggled for identity within academia. And that's the sort of lens in which I looked at a lot of different issues around schools. I wasn't really focusing on gender, but that was sort of the information I carried into the classrooms. And I had been doing this about 2 years when it started to hit me that almost every classroom I went into, there were kids sitting in the back of the classroom looking really disengaged, and they were overwhelmingly boys. And after like 2 years of seeing this, I started to think, gosh, I wonder what's going on. I knew that poor black boys were really struggling in school, and their difficulties had been fairly well documented. But man, that wasn't what I was seeing. I was seeing every kind of classroom that I went into, every ethnicity, at every social strata. I saw that girls were very engaged, and some boys were reasonably engaged, but a lot of boys in back of the classroom looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. So as a national reporter, it's very easy to go into a few classrooms and see a phenomenon a couple of different times and think you are seeing a trend, but you're actually seeing a cluster. So, and you write a story about some national trend that turns out to be like completely non-existent. It's like the reporter's nightmare. So what I ended up doing is I ended up spending a lot of time looking at data. So after a while, after I noticed this thing with boys, I started to look at the data. And I was really stunned by what I saw. So it turns out that boys are expelled from preschool at 5 times the rates of girls. Okay? So in the very first years of early education, they hit some rough water. Now, honestly, it kind of came as a shock. I didn't really realize kids got expelled from preschool. But I was like, wow, those are some numbers, but 5 times the rates of girls? What's going on there? So I'm just going to run through some of the data points that really jumped out at me. So they get expelled at 5 times the rates of girls. They're twice as likely to be identified as being special ed and put in special ed classes. They do less homework in elementary school, and they continue to do less homework all the way through middle and high school. They have lower grade point averages on the whole. 18 years ago, the kids at the bottom of the curve in terms of learning, in terms of scoring in schools, were about equally boys and girls. Now they're overwhelmingly boys. Boys take less rigorous courses in high school. They're less prepared for college. In the 80s, girls took fewer science courses and many fewer math courses than boys. And since 1992, girls have been taking more science and math courses and doing better in them than boys. Girls now take more geometry, algebra 2, pre-calculus biology, AP honors biology, and chemistry. Let me note that slightly more boys than girls take calculus, and boys still dominate in physics. Admissions to selective colleges has grown more competitive, as we know. But we also know that girls take many more APs than boys, and that when it comes to the number of kids who actually go to college, undergraduates, many schools are now overwhelmingly female. So it's about 60% female to about 40% male. And when you go into liberal arts campuses, you see that those numbers can be even more dramatic. So what you see is that colleges are beginning to weight admissions in disadvantaging girls. There's so many female applicants that they take less qualified boys over highly qualified girls. So beginning to look at those data points, I started to really wonder, well, what's going on with boys? What's causing this enormous disengagement? And then part of me, because I always doubt my thought, I have these great ideas and I think I'm a genius, and then appropriately, part of my brain says, wait a minute, does that really matter? I mean, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe boys don't do well at school. Maybe they bump along the bottom, but man, there's plenty of guys in Congress, right? Like not hurting them any. And like, look at those corporate boardrooms. Like, really? Like, so I have this dialectic in my head all the time, like, be careful there, Peg, don't get too enthusiastic. And I thought, well, maybe they're just fine. Like, maybe they're not into school, but they do fine in life. And then I started looking at sort of socio-emotional data. And so it turns out that girls report more stress and depression, school-age girls, and boys kill themselves at 5 times the rates of girls. I started to think, that's really not, we're really looking at like a serious problem here, right? And then when you look at adult accomplishment, you see that we have many, many more men than ever before who are disconnected from both school, young men, both disconnected from both school and the workplace. So we're creating boys and who grow into men who are not woven into the fabric of our society. And I began to see this as a very important issue to begin talking about and to begin writing about. And it's a little awkward for me because I actually thought I'd be writing about girls. And I enter this discussion not from a sort of backlash perspective, but from the perspective of someone who cherishes equality and someone who thinks that equal opportunity is crucial for our democracy. So I come at this as a progressive feminist, and I don't want to be part of any backlash argument, but I do want to be able to say with a clear eye, what is going on? Ask the question, what is going on here? Is this right for our society? And is there something we can do for boys that doesn't hurt our terrific high-performing girls? So having pulled out all that data and started to work with that, the next question that occurred to me is, well, what's creating this discrepancy? What's creating this gap? And let me note here at the beginning of my talk that not all boys are affected by this, and not all boys are affected equally. So everywhere you look, in every demographic, there's a thin margin of high-performing boys. Okay, it's very thin, and and at the very top, they do, in terms of grades and in terms of accomplishment, they do slightly better than girls. But when you get to the A level, not the A+ level, but the A to B- level or A to B level, the bench is very deep for girls. That's where you see the preponderance of females in school, really at that top level. And then you see a lot of boys in the B- to D level. There's a big sort of bulge there. And the problems that affect affluent boys, affluent white boys, are not the same problems that affect poor African American and Latino boys. And when you talk about like the crisis conversation around boys and education, we have to be clear. The consequences for poor African American boys who don't do well in school are much more grave than they are for white boys from Wilmette. All right, there's just a bigger social net for them to fall into than there is for poor black boys. Okay, so I want to be clear that when we're talking about boys, we're not all, it's half the population, and not every condition exists for every boy. So what happens in school? What do we know about what happens in school? Well, what I looked at is I looked first at reading. So reading is the kingpin skill of school success. If you can't read and you can't read competently, you really can't move forward in school. So what do we know about boys and reading? We know that, from national data, that boys come into school speaking fewer words and having had fewer pre-literacy type experiences going to the library, being read to, than girls. Now, the data is not clear about whether this is like some sort of inherent sexism on the part of parents not to read to their boys or not to take them to the library, or if they just would rather run around. Like, you can't really tease that out of the national numbers, but that's what we know. They come in speaking fewer words, having had fewer literacy type experiences. When they have those initial diagnostic tests, boys do less well in reading than girls. And that's a gap that grows every day that they're in school until they either drop out and graduate. So they continue to fall behind girls every year at a wider and wider margin, by a wider and wider margin. So what's happening in our schools? What's happening to boys that we're not engaging them in the life of the word? So I spent a long time looking at this, and what I write about in the book is that there's certain ways of teaching writing that I suggest, or actually the research suggests, might have disadvantaged boys. And there's also a larger backdrop to the way that we teach reading in school. And that is, it's become a very fiction-oriented pursuit. So in elementary school, kids read a lot of fiction. And I'll tell you, this was hammered home to me when I went to a second grade. A wonderful teacher who invited me in, and she said, you know, my boys, they're just not reading in the way that the girls are, and I don't know why. So I went into her classroom, and, you know, there's a lot that I don't know, so my role oftentimes is just observing and giving a little feedback to the teacher. And I did notice that she had reading groups, as most teachers do, and the fast readers were called the hares, and they were all mostly girls, and the slow readers were called like the tortoises, and they were mostly boys. And so the tortoises, so it was a reading group time, so the tortoises went in to see the reading specialist, and I got to talk to them. And I said, so guys, like, what is it with you guys in reading? You know, this is my excellent reporting skills, right? It's hard to talk to second graders. I had dinner with a second grade teacher just tonight, and my hat's off to her, because when you talk to second grade kids, they answer like they're from Mars. Like it's not linear often for them, right? So I'm like, so what is it with you guys? And, you know, they said, well, you know, honestly, they didn't say honestly. They were like, well, to tell you the truth, reading's kind of girly. And I was like, yeah, okay. Like, I thought, wow, that's so defensive, right? They're bad at it, so they immediately decide that it's girly. Like, where does that come from, that rapid defensive-ness, right? And I kind of judged those kids. I was kind of like, whew, that's really not a productive attitude, right? And so I said, okay. Moving away from that, you know, one, well, what do you guys like to read? And like, wow, we like to read sports books, and we like to read books about stuff. They meant science. Plants and stars and stuff, yeah. And we like to read, and they mention a book that no girl has ever read, the Guinness Book of World Records. And I was like, really? I thought it was about a guy with a long beard, like the guy with the longest beard. Like, that's it. You know, like the smallest man, the tallest man. But they had a long, you know, array of books that they liked to read. Okay, so I wrote this all down in my notebook, very official. You know, they seemed satisfied. And so then we tramped back into the classroom, and they were making individual selections of their books. And, you know, I looked around the room, and I suddenly had the eyes of a tortoise. And I realized that the books in the teacher's classroom, now this teacher loves to teach reading. She had me in there because she's concerned about her books. But the books that she put in the classroom were overwhelmingly books about girls. They had pinkish kind of girlish covers. I was laughingly talking about this earlier, girl in Jep stories, like girls in Jeopardy stories, right? And largely fiction. And I suddenly realized why the boys were saying reading is girly, because, man, reading's girly, right? I was like, oh, I get it. If your sense of gender is very binary, as it is with second graders, you know, like it's about as sophisticated as those signs on restrooms, you know, women's room, men's room, like women wear dresses, boys, you know, men have short hair. Like they're not that sophisticated. They're in second grade. If your idea of gender is so very binary as it is appropriately at that age, and a teacher has that kind of library, reading is really girly. So I would suggest to you that we need to change what we put in our children's classrooms and in our children's libraries. And we need to open the door for the kinds of books that boys like to read. Now, we need to teach them to read, and we need to teach them to read very well, and we need to teach them to reading comprehension and help them build reading comprehension. But in order to do that, they need to read, because reading begets reading. The more you read, the more you can read. So many times parents get in touch with me and they say, my son doesn't read. And I say, oh, really? Well, what does he like to read? He says, just those darn comic books, but I took them away. I'm like, don't do that, right? Like, I would suggest to you, now, we don't want to live in a world where boys are reading The Guest, We Pass, and girls are reading Middlemarch. You know, like we don't want to bifurcate them and dumb it down for boys. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I'm suggesting is we need to bring boys into the life of the word. We need to make this have an equally as masculine identity as it does a feminine identity in elementary schools. I think that would be progress. And many librarians around the country I've spoken in many, many schools, and some librarians have acted on this. And they have actually areas of high interest for boys. And one librarian, I'll tell you, I think she's a genius. She knows the boys who are struggling in reading, and she picks them out sort of subtly. She meets them in a quiet moment, and she hands them a book, and she says, "This is a really bad book. Don't let anyone know you're reading it because they'll be really mad." Okay? It's disgraceful. It's full of violence, and it's full of like people getting shot with arrows, and whatever you do. And she actually has it in brown paper so you can't actually see the cover. It's like, she's fantastic. She's like, I think it even says caution on the outside. It's like, really, she's like, here it is. Keep it hidden in your backpack. Don't let anyone know you're reading it. I'm giving it to you, but it's our secret. Okay? Is that genius or what? Is that genius? She's a genius, right? She makes reading into a subversive activity. How can you say that it's girly when the librarian is slipping you a book in brown paper? Okay, so I think these are small things you can do. They're environmental things that you can change. In the book, I do talk about research around ways to teach reading that seem to work better for boys, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Unless you want to ask, I'm happy to get into it later, or you can read about it in the book. But I just want to posit that this is one thing that we can do. And when you go into classrooms, if you are in classrooms, if you're teachers, if you're librarians, if you're parents, if you're grandparents, go in, take a look, okay? If you're going to your son or your grandson or your nephew's room and there's no books, find out what he likes to read. Make sure he's exposed to books. It doesn't matter if it's Captain Underpants. I'm good with it, okay? You can tell his mom, I'm good with it, all right? Captain Underpants, it's very ribald in its humor. I think it's kind of silly, but boys seem to like it. Let him go, okay? Graphic novels, comic books, all good. So what else is happening in schools that could be hurting our son's progress? I would suggest to you that recess plays a much bigger role than any of us could have anticipated, unless maybe you're male, okay? Recess, not a big deal to me. I have to tell you, I didn't really think about it as part of school. Like, it sort of seemed like, for me, from my personal Peg Tyre experience, it seemed like sort of an annoyance, right? Because it was sort of loud and disruptive and often cold on the playground. But when I talk to boys, many of them go to school only for recess, okay? They consider it a subject, okay? And of course I dismiss this because it's completely out of my experience, but when I began to look at the data around boys and how boys fall out of the pipeline that carries them from kindergarten to 12th grade, I began to see that there are certain forces that are at work that seem to suggest that recess plays a stronger role in their education than we would have thought. So since, I guess probably we can date this from about 15 or 20 years ago, we've had some idea that recess is a waste of time and that we really need to have children in seats being instructed, and that gym and recess are kind of add-on subjects. And there is some data around, dose-related instruction. The more actually teaching you do, the more kids learn, stands to reason. But the problem is, kids move around a lot. And many kids move around a lot more than a lot, okay? And this seems to be flying right in the face of their natural development. Now, whenever I talk about the natural development or make assumptions about gender, about boys, I always feel like I'm on thin ice because anybody can say anything about boys. Anyone can say anything about girls. And you know what? They have said things about girls like our brains are too small to vote and blah, blah, blah. So like, I'm always really careful like whenever I make a conjecture about like half the human race. So I did find someone who studies children and movement. And this is what I love about what I do. Like, I can have some half-baked idea, and then I can find somebody who's spent their entire life, like 40 years, like plumbing the depths of it, and I just get to talk to them. It's great. I have a great job. So I did find Warren Eaton, who's a Canadian professor, and his life's work is to measure how much kids move around. And he set them up with little motion detectors, and he lets them play, and he graphs it all out. It was my idea that perhaps because we're seeing a reduction in the amount of time kids are given for recess, and we're seeing rising rates of boys falling out of the system and boys being diagnosed with ADHD, that perhaps there was some relation. So I talked to Warren Eaton about what he saw. My idea was that boys move around more than girls. All right, am I out on a limb? Nah. But I figured, let's see what real experts think instead of just me. And so I talked to him, and he sent me a tremendous number of graphs. Like, so many that it was a lot. All right, this is his life's work. So what he showed me is that he had graphed the movement of boys and girls. And so here's girls, their movement patterns are in a bell curve. There's some girls who are quite sedentary, some girls who move around a lot, and many girls who move around a lot, and a few girls who move around a whole lot, right? And then there's a graph for boys, and then there's a big overlap, okay? So boys don't move around a whole lot more, in the main, don't move around a whole lot more than girls, okay? But when you look at the outliers, okay, there's your gender split. So the most sedentary children tend to be overwhelmingly female, and the most active children tend to be overwhelmingly male. So what you're looking at is probably what any second grade teacher could tell me, and that is the kids who have ants in their pants, who really are like climbing the walls, are overwhelmingly boys. So what happens in schools as a result of this very natural development, that some kids are outlier sedentary, some kids are outlier active? Well, the outlier active kids, who are overwhelmingly boys, get crushed. They get crushed by a system that doesn't understand their natural development. And I would suggest to you that in early elementary school and right through elementary school, they are in a downpour of negativity from the people in authority, who are overwhelmingly female. And they say, stop fooling around, Stephen. Stop playing with the math manipulatives, Michael. Sit up straight, Peter. On and on and on and on. Classroom management is a huge issue for teachers. I'm not trying to say it's not. I'm not trying to say that teachers aren't doing the very best they can. But I think if teachers realized that those same kids who are being called out on the way that they move and their inability to control their little impulses are the same kids who, in 6th and 7th grade, they're sitting in classrooms and the teachers are saying to each other, I don't even know how to teach him. He's so disengaged. I don't even know where learning takes place. Why, oh why is he like this? It must be something happening at home. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. But I would suggest to you it's something that also happened in 2nd grade. Not 2nd grade. Not in her class. But that this has been going on, that they are in a reign of negativity, and it has pronounced downstream effects. And I don't think any teachers are trying to do it on purpose. I don't. Maybe, I've been talking about this for a long time. I've met maybe one teacher that I thought was kind of nutty, and the rest of them are super well-meaning, right? There's a lot of reporters who are really nutty. A lot of every people who are a little nutty. They just don't know. And they begin to think that girls are the gold standard and boys are the defective girls. And that attitude permeates the learning environment in which we send our sons to school. And then we wonder why they're not thriving. And then we look at our colleges and say, why don't boys go on to higher education? Why don't they do homework? So recess, movement, tolerance for movement, tolerance for the natural physical development of all our children, seems to be something that part of the conversation that we can begin having again. Now, the American Association of Pediatrics says that our children need to move around to be at their cognitive peak. You know that, I know that. If we sit in front of the computer too long, we get dull, right? But we don't allow children to have that privilege regularly. And my favorite thing, my least favorite thing that happens, the thing I would call out as the most evil thing that happens in elementary school is when you lose recess for not behaving. Okay, so you can't control your body, and so instead of having a chance to go and move around and expel some of your energy, you can't do that because you can't control your body. It makes no sense, people. It makes no sense. Okay, I would suggest to you that children need to run around, that we all need to run around, and that we need to make sure we need to guard recess and make sure that our children have it K through 12th grade. They're not going to run around in 12th grade unless someone's chasing them, but at least they need downtime, right? Or at least they run to Starbucks. That's what they do in 12th grade. We need to put that back in our schools. So hold on a second, I just want to check my time because I have to tell you, I can outspeak your ability to listen. I know I can, I've done it. So just so that you know, it's 7:34 and I'm going to probably talk until a little before 8, maybe 10 before 8, and then take questions, okay? I don't know about you, but when someone's lecturing me, part of my mind is always going, when is this going to be over? So now you know. So one of the things I see now is I see that we were talking about this earlier also today with some of the teachers and students here, is that schools K through 12 are largely female environments, especially in the early grades. And I think that we make some mistakes about boys, and we make mistakes about who boys are in our learning communities. And one of the things that one of the big mistakes that we make and devastating mistakes that we make is we fail to see and validate the relationships between boys. And you see this, like relationships between girls, there's like books written about it. It's called sisterhood. And there's a lot, we recognize that girls form relationships with other girls and get a lot of support from those relationships. And when we see girls together, we think like, oh, good, they're friends. Like, hope that's going okay, but it's good that they're friends, right? Or they're best friends, or they're best friends. They've been best friends for 5 years. We understand it, we see it, and we understand the way girls weave relationships together. And we support it. And I would suggest to you that we don't have that same value on boys' relationships. When we see two boys together, we think, there's trouble. You guys, split up. I know you guys are going to be talking, split up, okay? We don't value the relationships that boys have. And partially it's because many women, including myself, they don't talk about their BFFs all that much, okay? They're not disclosing about their relationships. They don't seem to value them in their communication, their verbal communication. And yet, when you look at the research, those friendships are the most important things to boys. They are the medicine that all boys need. And yet, when we see boys together, we say there's trouble. And they internalize our negativity about their friendships until sometimes in middle school I see boys sitting and there's empty seats in a movie theater and there's empty seats between the boys, right? And when they ask them, they say they don't want to seem gay, right? It's an anti-gay thing. But I think it's something different. I think they absorb a lot of negativity about what it is to be friends with other boys, and that's just how they express it. Maybe there's homophobia in there, and that's worth addressing. But I think they can't really say, he's my friend. We don't really give them those relationships value. So I think in our schools, if we could change that, if we could support boys' friendships, support boys' positive friendships, if we could identify teachers who could serve as good role models, who would then also have connections to the boys, I think we're not recognizing that boys depend on connectivity. and we're not giving them connectivity, especially early on. Part of that has to do with the fact that there are so few male teachers. We're at a 30-year low for men in education. We need to, I think, invite more men into our schools, but we also need to find a way to keep men in our schools. But, you know, really, again, I'd much rather see a great teacher who's a great teacher than a guy who's just a guy, right? I think a great teacher can connect. My view and what I've seen is that a great teacher who understands boys can be male or female, and boys are cool with it. As long as they think that they have a chance with that teacher, they're okay if it's female. That said, I think early on, boys get the idea that school is a very female enterprise. There's very few men in school. There's very few men in the classrooms. There's a brilliant program in San Francisco, outside of San Francisco, where they have a dad's club, which is actually, because it's San Francisco, it's actually not just men. And because it's all like, you know, kind of gender neutral, but it is called the Dad's Club. And there are a lot of dads who go there, and they do a lot of like He-Man dad stuff. Like they wear dad's t-shirts, Dad's Club t-shirts, and when lines need to be painted in the school, the dads come in. And during the day, they take time off from work, and they move blackboards, and they set stuff up. They do all that, like, you know, burly stuff. And the school likes it because it changes the energy and it changes the balance in the school. And I think if we can get more men engaged in education, if we can get more parents, male parents visiting, being part of that process, if we can get more men reading and have their sons catching them reading, I think it's all for the good. It all contributes to what we need to helping lifting our sons up. So, reading, recess, and I'm going to do a little bit about boy and girl brain difference. So it's not what you think. So there's and then I think I better stop and take your questions. Wait, let me check my time. Yes. So there's a discussion about in popular culture about boys and girls learning differences and how their brains work differently. And I have to tell you that I was quite enraptured by this idea because it makes total sense to me. I don't think the Three Stooges is funny. My sons do. What is that? Right? It's got to be brain difference, right? Like they're laughing like hyenas, and I'm just like, yeah, I'm going upstairs, right? I don't get it. So when I first started reading about this boy and girl brain difference, I was like, bingo, right? And I wrote about it, I have to admit, I wrote about it in Newsweek in a pretty complimentary way. And I got a lot of letters from super smart people, like brain scientists, and they were like, you are so wrong about this. And I was like, oh, hate that. So I was initially defensive, you know, as anyone would be. And then I actually followed up with them, and I was like, well, how wrong was I? And they were like, yeah, come into my lab. So I went to visit the people who were insulting me and my life. And people who actually study the brain do not identify a female brain and a male brain. Okay, the discussion, and it's popularized by a few different writers. Michael Gurian is one of them, and I know him, and I think he's coming from a good place. But he writes about how girls' brains, because they have a certain hormonal component, express themselves in one way because they have oxytocin, they are more connective, and they learn in a more connective way, and they like warmer rooms that are pastel colors, and boys, because they have more testosterone, need to run around, and they like competitive learning. And, you know, I got to tell you, it makes sense to me, but the science is not there. It turns out brains don't really work like that. Like, no one really knows that there's like a difference in brain and that it responds in this particular way. Like the difference, that there's no difference between nature and nurture. Like it's all kind of smushed together. And how children respond to learning is variable. Yes, it seems like boys and girls are really, really different. But we can't say it's because of a certain brain structure or a certain expression of genes. We don't have that kind of science. And anyone who suggests that we do, I suggest you check their science, because it's just not there. And I think we walk down a sort of dangerous path when we say boys learn like this, okay? Because there's a lot of different kinds of boys. And we say girls learn like this. Just be careful of people who step out in front of the science, because I think we can get into a sort of culturally and politically shaped view of gender. And I think it's very dangerous. I would say, though, that what I did learn about boy and girl brains was from a pathologist in Boston. And tragically, she has cross-sections of the adolescent brain that she's kept over 40, 50 years. And what she can show you is that brains of boys and brains of girls develop at a different rate. So, which is not to say that 16-year-old girls make good decisions, but 16-year-old boys are going to make much less good decisions. The actual connections in their neurons come later. The myelin sheathing that covers the nerve endings develops later in boys than it does in girls. And insurance companies know this, which is why it's more expensive to get car insurance for boys than it is for girls. And as you age, the rates are the same for boys and girls, but the brain develops more slowly. Unfortunately, in our system of education, we sort our children at age 17, at a time when girls, as I said earlier, to some friends I had dinner with, girls look like supermodels and boys look like they're made of cast-off parts at 17. I mean, the difference is striking at that age. And that's the age when we decide where they're going to go to college and who's going to get into what schools. So what we see now on campuses, as you know, and as I've mentioned, that undergraduates are now about 60-40 in favor of, weighted towards females. And I would suggest to you that our system needs to change. It is changing, but we need to keep the light on for boys and higher education maybe a little longer than we do for girls. You know, it might not be linear for a lot of boys. There might be benefits for them to not go to school and then to actually regain school and pick up their education later. There might be a reason not to shut the door on higher education, not to talk about boys as not college material when they're 17 and a half, but rather to revisit that at 23 or 24. The cross-sections of brains indicated that boys don't really catch up until they're about 26, okay? Which is, you know, in our culture, late for higher education, or the traditional higher education, but I think more and more you're seeing people pick up education, formal education later, and especially boys. And I think that's an idea that we're going to have to get our minds around for a lot of different kids as we see fewer and fewer boys going into higher education. Proportionally, actually, just to be clear, more people in general are going to higher education, but the proportion of boys is less than girls. So I would like to see our schools change. I would like to see that more awareness among teachers. I think teachers can change this. I think teachers and administrators who are sensitive to these issues, who understand that reading is crucial, that we need to engage boys in the life of the word, could change things in a year's time for a group of students. I think administrators and teachers who think about scheduling, who think about recess, who think about how to engage boys and keep boys engaged in school can really make a difference. I don't think it's going to require federal law and massive congressional funding, and it's a good thing because I don't think we're going to get that. But I would say to you that if you have an opportunity to have this discussion with a teacher, if you are a teacher and you have the opportunity to have this discussion in your teacher's lounge, it's worth doing. It's worth bringing these topics up. There must be a way that we can begin to talk about what's hurting our boys and come up with solutions that don't hurt our terrific, high-performing girls. This is not an anti-girl conversation, but a pro-person conversation, and a conversation that's really thinking about what's best for our future. So I'm happy to take questions. I often find this is the best part of the talk because I get to hear from you. So does someone want to start off? Don't be shy. Yeah, not shy. Good.
I was going to say, if you have a question for Ms. Tyre, if you would come around to the side aisles. Two of us have microphones.
Hello, my name's Pete Serby. I've taught boys for about 12 years now, and I just have a question for you. Have you ever run into a school that's like a territory for boys, like where spaces, learning spaces, the way they design the whole campus is kind of designed or crafted for boys so that they can come of age? Because it seems like, this goes back to your last point, it seems that there's an extended adolescence these days for a lot of boys where they don't become men early enough, and a lot of the old coming-of-age rituals, apprenticeships, and seeing how to become a man at a young age are not present. So it seems like there's a lot of paperwork and pretend going on in school, and boys seem really kind of turned off. Have you ever seen a school that really engages them with active learning and helps them come of age to be men?
I have, actually. There's a fellow by the name of Roy Nell Young, who I think was a big NFL player, although that part's lost on me. And he runs a school in Houston that is for poor African-American boys. And they're doing a lot of that coming of age training and making and ritual. And I think that they find it very effective for dealing with boys with low motivation, because what you're seeing, I think, is reflected in his practice, that the more ritual you can give, the more of a roadmap that you can supply boys who maybe don't have a father on the scene, the more of a roadmap you can give them to what adult masculinity looks like, the more engaged they are and the more motivation they show. So, good question. And I would say to you, interestingly, he's now admitting girls into his school. So I don't know what that's about, but I'll find out.
Okay. You talked a lot about the role that elementary schools and elementary education has in perhaps hindering boys' academic achievement. And this is kind of negatively phrased, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on maybe the unique role that middle schools, junior highs play in hindering boys' academic achievement.
I do, actually. I have bad thoughts about middle school. And it's not just because it was bad for me. Yeah, I think that middle school is where that relational issue of us not recognizing and giving relationships between boys value comes into full flower. I think that at that time, of course, children are very vulnerable. And I think that we do not understand or value boys' connections to each other and connections to the teacher. I think that by then, boys are making a transition between learning to read to reading to learn. And if you don't know how to read particularly well, as many boys don't, that's a very big obstacle in your academic progress. And at the same time, so while many of them are starting to see declines in their performance, and getting a lot of negative feedback about that, they don't have any protection. They're very isolated. We tend to isolate them socially. And what I see is that boys are, entering the electronic plaza, public plaza, right? And that can be valuable. I have to say, I used to be a video game hater, and I'm not. I've changed my view based on reality and research. But I think that we don't really give them a place to connect. Sometimes I see boys with those headphones on, they're playing games with other people that they don't know. And I think that in a way that's the only space we give them to be friends. And that is something that's completely mediated by screens and electronics and fake names and avatars.
Thank you, Peg, for your book. Just pathfinding. I have so many questions, I don't know where to start. Let's start with the first question, the beginning. Sounds good. If we're saying that boys they're on a different socio-emotional trajectory, because even if the neurosciences, those who are like Gurian say that, you have these hard categories. But whatever it is, they come into the classroom at a level, socio-emotional level, that is not at par with girls. And maybe even kinesthetically, they are they are overly charged. What happens to these children if the teacher has a mindset that, or it's a policy that she has to get them up to to snuff. You know, she has to bring up their scores. And so these kids are not, because if that's correct, they're not developmentally ready for a sit down, don't touch that, don't move, you're moving too much, you're squirming. If that's not there, if that's not where they are developmentally, what damage could that do to that child moving forward? That's my first question.
So I hear some concern in your question, and I have to answer it in two ways. So being an active boy is not a reason not to teach your child. Having an active boy in your class is not a reason not to teach them. Everybody needs good, solid instruction in reading and math, really, and in writing and history, like really, and hopefully music and art and opportunities to do music and art. Like everybody needs that, even if you're super ants in your pants, or there needs to be ways. A kid who is very active is not active at every minute. They're active because they're overactive in an environment that requires them to be too quiet. Okay, so if you can mix it up, I mean, if you have an active child, you know that on Saturday morning you have to hit the brick and get them outside, otherwise they will be swinging off the chandeliers, right? Parents know this. We know that we have to pace our children. If you need them to sit in church, you need them to let them run around for a solid hour and 15 minutes before that, so you can get that kind of performance out of them, right? But schools often don't allow teachers to have that flexibility, or the schedule in the day doesn't allow that schools to have that, teachers to have that flexibility. And I think that's a shame. However, there needs to be a way, I mean, when boy meets school and school is unyielding, okay, we see what the results are. You know, boys can easily fall out of the pipeline, and it's bad news. But it's a conversation that we have to have, not just about one child, but about a whole classroom full of children. And I suggest to you, if your child is struggling in school, if your son is struggling in school, talk to other parents of boys, because it's never the one. It's always the six boys, okay? So you can make changes in a school. Hard to do on your own. You know, one parent is like considered by principals to be sort of a fruitcake, and two is like a fruitcake with friends, but five is a force to be reckoned with. And like, if you talk to other parents and find out other kids boys and maybe highly active girls who might be having issues, it would be worth opening that conversation with a teacher or a principal. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, you.
During your years of research, you've talked to a lot of teachers. Did you talk to both public and private schools? And did you see a difference between the behaviors of boys in public versus private?
So it's so variable. Like, independent schools are so variable, and public schools are so variable. And I have big love for public school teachers, largely because the independent schools get to handpick their kids, and public schools teachers just have to take whatever comes down the pipe. You know, they just have to, whatever's on the conveyor belt, they got to teach it. You know, and whether it's a kid with low skills or high skills, they just seem like Shiva. You know, that goddess with so many arms. That's what public schools teachers remind me of. So I don't think that there's public schools or private schools that handle this particularly well. There's individual schools that do, but not on the basis of their public or privateness.
I think I kind of wondered, because I don't have a child. My child goes to public school, and I think there's a little more structure. I mean, it doesn't seem like they have as much flexibility in what they can change and can't change. And I guess my question was, is there more flexibility in like a private school setting that allows them to have more recess, or put recess in the morning, or whatever the kind of the magic schedule is that it allows boys to be a little bit more successful at an earlier age?
Yeah, I think the best schools I've seen, you know, I've seen public and private schools that bake that into their schedule, that start to think about scheduling and how to get the best out of their boys, both public and private. So I don't think it's that issue. Yeah.
Hi, I loved your suggestions for young boys, the early reading, Captain Underpants, the recess, all that. And I'm wondering if you have any quick little suggestions for boys 10 years down the line. The C student, 16-year-old who's just kind of not doing what they could. Or is it too late?
It's not too late. I just want to say it's not too late, okay? You're just catching them at a bad time, okay? I don't know. I feel like the champion of like the B- student because, what you often are seeing at that age is disengagement. And they're just tolerating school. And they're just kind of counting down the days until they can stop dealing with it. And it doesn't mean that they're not going to deal with it again. Doesn't mean they're not going to pick it up again. But right now, for where they are, it's not touching them, their essential selves. They're not, high-performing girls get in a positive feedback loop with their awesome teachers, and they're constantly stroked because they follow the rules. And just not to digress too much, but I think in some ways we do our girls a disservice in that way because we are raising generations of rule followers. And they do really well in school and they do terribly in the workplace. Sheryl Sandberg will tell you, they just follow the rules and they're 30 years old and then the rules become have a baby and bill 90 hours a week at your law firm. And they go they go crazy, right? Because we've raised this generation of girls in this positive feedback loop to be rule followers. And boys many boys grow up outside of that loop. And there's something about school that they retract from it. Their essential selves remain untouched by anything that happens from 8 until 3. I just often talk to boys and, the issue of homework comes up a lot because boys don't tend to do it. And teachers who make that an important part of your grade, boys don't tend to do well in those classes. And I often talk to boys about why they don't do homework, and they say, they have me from 8 to 3, and that's enough. And they mean it, okay? Like, I learned from those tortoises, you have to take them at their word. They mean that. There's something that's it's so retracted from the school that we send them, the schools that we send them to. They're just tolerating it. I would say that, if you're speaking as a parent or someone who's connected to an unmotivated 16-year-old boy, since I wrote this book, I've been, I wouldn't say besieged, but very, very, very frequently, very highly successful men buttonhole me at parties or email me or call me or seek me out, and they say, I was that student. And they all say this. And then I got to be about 24, and I realized how they wanted me to think, and everything changed. And I mean, these are names of people who you'd recognize, like who you've read about. And it's happened to me so many times that I have a little hope that if we can keep a hand on their back and a foot on their butt, that maybe we can get them, if not, through high school and maybe into some sort of post-secondary education until the lights start to turn on more for them.
I was pretty fascinated by your brain research, and I know that there's not a lot of physical differences of the human brain, but I know in our district where I teach, we've been doing a lot more in the learning styles and really trying to meet the needs of children through their learning styles, because there are boys who learn more similar to some girls and vice versa. My question goes more into, have you seen the impact of the Common Core standards on boys and how it impacts them positively or negatively based on the decreased breadth of the learning standards, but more about the depth, and then more of an emphasis on the nonfiction type of literature and things like that versus so much of the fiction that we've seen in elementary schools?
I'm very encouraged by the Common Core. It's going to require that our schools provide writing instruction and word study and deeper reading ability, and fostering deeper reading abilities for our kids. And that's going to be very difficult for boys because we're already so far behind and they come into school far behind. But it requires schools to think more deeply and to elicit deeper thinking from our kids. And I think that is all for the good. One of the things that I'm in schools a lot is I'm often stunned by how dumb the curriculum is and how content-free it is and how these fluffy bits of fiction that are not even good writing it's terrible writing. I don't know who, somebody at Pearson, I hope no one's from Pearson is here, but someone is coming up with this. It's just disastrous. And our kids spend their precious moments in school on that kind of thing. If we can bring richer text, real texts that are about something, increase their knowledge of the world, of the founding documents of the United States, about history, about science, I think it's all for the good. We learn that kids learn to read, comprehend words by knowing about content, and yet we deprive them in many schools of content. And now with in the wake of No Child Left Behind, we focus in many poor schools on reading and math as if those are two isolated skills. Like, that you can teach in isolation, which is nonsense. As a teacher, I'm sure you know that. So I'm encouraged about the Common Core.
Hi, I was just curious what your research and what your opinion would be on the move to having kindergarten go full-time versus half-days, and what your thoughts were on that trend.
I don't think there's any really good research on that. I haven't seen it if there is. I do know that there's a lot of parents who are holding their boys out of kindergarten. They're redshirting them for a year. And I see that in affluent areas where moms can stay out of the workforce for another year, they'll hold their sons out because they're just look at what's required or what the girls are doing, and they think my son's just not developmentally ready. I think that can have downstream effects that you don't anticipate, like when your son is 19 and dating a 14-year-old freshman. And okay, it could be fine. It could be weird, right? So like you're not really thinking about that when you're holding them out from kindergarten, but that happens, right? So in terms of half-day and full-day kindergarten, the answer is I don't know. I think it depends on the kindergarten and depends on the child, right?
Well, my question was in regards to the holding back of boys, because it seems to be a really big trend, at least around here.
Holding them out or holding them back?
Holding them back from kindergarten.
Oh, yeah.
Based on maturity level, based on, I guess, age. I think around here it has a lot to do with sports, to be honest with you, and the size of the child. That's just my own person. No, I'm not kidding.
Funny.
If you asked a lot of moms, they would probably agree that you think forward to, well, I want my son to be bigger so that he'll play sports better later.
All right, who thinks that? See? Nobody.
No, I'm
teasing.
I think they would know that it's certainly
no one's going to raise their hand,
lot,
obviously.
I think in Elmhurst, for sure, sports is really, really big here.
I get it.
But have you seen, I don't know how long that trend has been happening, and I'm curious as to whether it matches with some of the decline as far as, because I do think there can be positive effects to holding boys back, certainly, but I think there can also probably be negative effects to doing that, and maybe the message that it sends them. Like you were saying about the not sitting still and all that kind of stuff, the message that it would send, even like a 4-year-old boy is, well, you're not mature enough to go on to do what everyone else is doing. I don't know. I didn't know if you had any research behind it.
I don't think there is. I think it sort of depends on how you present it. Like, hey, another year of preschool, awesome. I don't think there's good research on it. Like I said, I don't think it's a terrible idea. I see that it's a strong trend. I actually thought it was more about the development of the child than about sports. I hadn't even thought that, but you teach me something new. So, no, I'm sure you're right. So I think that it can be sound. I think that can be a good thing to do. I mean, you don't want your son to go in, when you know what the expulsion rate is, when you know how readily boys are left behind in the grades because they're not ready to move forward. It's not a terrible idea. I'm not against it.
Hi. You might have already addressed this with the public school and private school, but I was wondering if you came across any research in regards to Montessori school and if self-directed learning, how that affects boys in the younger grades.
So how do you think about self-directed learning? I guess I don't really know what you mean.
They choose what they would learn each day. They would choose, I'm going to trace letters today. They choose, they're going to build with blocks today. They would choose what they're going to do. Rather than a teacher up instructing, they pick something and they do it.
Just for pre-K or all
Well,
through?
there's Montessori that goes to 8th grade.
Yeah, I'm not down with that. I just want to say.
I would suggest you research
I just want to
because
say
it's
that I sent my
fascinating.
kids to like total hippie schools, and like now when I wrote the good school and realized what actually should happen in a preschool, I was like, I cannot believe. I really do believe that preschool should not be about worksheets. Let me just say at the outset, like please, okay. But a preschool teacher needs to know how to teach pre-literacy skills because she needs to prime those children for reading, not with worksheets, but with in a million different other ways, surrounding them with words, giving them opportunities to speak, to listen, to be read to recognize language, to make sound and letter correspondence. All those things are things that teachers need to bring into a preschool curriculum, okay? And the idea that a child could select what I think that there's ways that experienced teachers have figured out to deliver information that grows on itself. And I don't believe in the sort of naturalistic idea that there's learning inside of children and you just need to let it out. Like, no. I actually think I want my children to be taught, and I think I want them to be taught by educational ninjas, and I want them to be taught in the kindest possible way, in the most relational way that makes them love school and I want my kids to think their teachers are rock stars, but no, I don't want them to select what they want to do. I've changed. The research for me, the research didn't really bear that out, and trust me, I started in that place, okay? Started there, but I'm not there now. And maybe it's just because I'm old, but I don't think so. I think that actually when you look at the research, direct instruction is crucial, especially around things like reading. Like a quarter of kids learn to read like you sneeze. It just happens, right? Achoo, they learn to read, okay? About half of kids really need some level of specific instruction, and about a quarter of the kids, if they don't get it, will never learn to read, okay? And what we see in this country is a third of kids actually don't learn to read particularly well. A third of kids. Okay, that's appalling. That's appalling. Scientists tell us that we should be able to teach reading to all but about 6% of kids who are developmentally unable to learn to read. They have profound developmental delays. And yet we turn kids out of our school systems, a third of which can't read. So I believe there's actually best practices, and I believe that they should be vigorously tested and brought into classrooms. And so, yeah, sorry.
That's okay. My son was the odd one that actually was expelled from pre-K. So we're just trying to survive through kindergarten.
He's not the odd one. It turns out he's leading the pack. It just, all getting, really. And you know what? You'll come back from that, and so will he.
Thank you.
About a month ago, we had a speaker here named Jonathan Mooney. And his topic was empowering students with learning differences. And one of the interesting things that I'm hearing tonight is that some of your themes are pretty close to the themes that he was raising in terms of how we should be educating students with learning differences. And I wondered if you had encountered him in the past or any of the work that he's done.
I have not. Is he a young man who went to an Ivy League school?
Yes, he's someone who was apparently early on judged to be really severely learning disabled. Eventually went to Brown, still says he reads, I think he said at a 7th grade level, and he has people read to him, but he writes books and he lectures. He said, for example, that a lot of things that affect students who are disabled are inability to comply with rules, which was, I think I heard one of the themes that you had mentioned, that there's the learning and then there's the compliance with the rules. So I just wondered whether or not you encountered that before.
I'm aware of him, and I'm aware of his work, but I haven't dived into it. No, but yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what the overlap in our work would be, except that compliance, of course, is the way a lot of students are measured, and they're evaluated on the basis of their compliance, and I think that's misguided. I think that, we talk about we talk about teaching creativity in schools, it makes you want to laugh. Okay, like, really? That's not going to happen, right? Like, if you know how to teach creativity, you come up here and you give this lecture because we need to hear that. I don't believe you can teach creativity. I think you create an environment where kids can be creative. And when you talk about learning that comes from a child, I think creativity does come from the individual. That is innate. So I would be very careful of schools that crush kids in that way. It's getting kind of deep here.
You very briefly mentioned video games earlier. I'm a mother of 3 middle school boys, so I'm very curious if, can you expand some more about video games, and is there any correlation with the disengagement that they have in the middle school and high school levels?
So I hate video games. There it is, my prejudice. And I hated that my kids started playing them, and I held it off as long as I possibly could. And then they were like, "You're turning us into freaks. We don't know what anyone's talking about." And I lost. And I was like, "Okay, but you can only play them on Saturday," and that was a joke, right? And I was like, "And you can only play the games that are E for everyone." And that was a joke too. I don't know. Their friends would come over, and suddenly all these M games came out of like behind the couch. It was crazy, right? And the other thing, one of the reasons I hated them is they never turned off the video game. It was always me going, "I'm gonna hit this with a sledgehammer unless you turn this off," right? It turned me into a shrew. And they never turned it off and were like, "Oh, that was a good game, let's go read." It was always like, right? And the bloodshed, and the whole thing about the violence. I was like, God, I actually, in my career as a reporter, covered crime, and I covered homicides in New York City when the crime rate was 2,000. I saw a lot of crime. I was very, of course, the questions for me was, why is this happening? And I was very interested in a West Point psychologist who wrote a book called On Killing, and he suggested that video gaming, it was then in arcades, that's how old I am, was actually taking the psychological safety off our children. It was creating sort of a generation of killers. And I was pretty persuaded by this research, which is why when my kids were playing first-person shooters, I was like sick. I was like, oh, they're going to be serial killers. So I went, and also, if it weren't going to be serial killers, I worried that they were going to be addicts. Because as I said, they never really switched sets. They never stopped doing it. They would just keep doing it. So to prove my point, from my book, I went out to Washington and talked to some therapists who work with kids who are video game addicts, and they're all boys. And when I met them, in some ways, most of them had really obvious social problems, and probably the majority of them were. I'm not a diagnosing psychologist, but they had profound social problems. Like video game addiction was clearly the symptom of a larger thing that was going on. But nevertheless, I talked to these kids. They were video game addicts. They wrecked their lives. They thought they were their avatars. They carried around their computers and everything with them. They wouldn't be part of it. And I was full of steam. I was like, that's it. That Xbox is out of my house. And so I flew back from Washington, walked in my door in Brooklyn, threw down my bag, grabbed that Xbox, and my kids came thundering down the stairs like, uh-oh, Mom's on a tear, right? And their eyes were like saucers. They immediately grasped what was happening, and they were like, wait, you need to do more research. I was like, what? Pulling it out. They're like, you're just going to be another middle-aged person railing about video games. You don't want to be that uninformed. I was like, right in the back, right? I was like, oh. So I was like, all right, I'll put this down. So like, you should play. I was like, oh, I hate these games. So I started playing with them, and I will tell you that my turn lasted like 2 seconds, and their turn lasted like 9 minutes. I was like, are we playing this right? They were like, yeah, you just stink at this game. I mean, literally, I would be like, that's my turn? Like, he died right away. They're like, yeah, you got to do the thing. And it swirls around in a way that I found really like sickening. And then I actually started to do more research after my playing Mortal Kombat or whatever I was playing, and Call of Duty, Peg Tyre, Call of Duty. This is where parenthood has taken me. And I went and I started to research people who are doing, learning through video games. And this is a field that's really burgeoning every day. There's more and more products. Amplify, which is part of Wireless Generation, is doing a video game product in which middle school and high school curriculum is pretty much embedded in the video game. What we see is that video games are very carefully calibrated lesson plans in which you can deliver information, test a skill, and then reward it almost immediately. So your children are actually moving through a process towards mastery of something like, shooting somebody, but it's a process of mastery that mimics anything a good teacher would do. So, and I will also tell you that the prevalence of video games, the saturation is almost 100%, okay? All boys seem to play video. I think data-wise, all boys play video games. It's about 100%. And the rates of youth violence in the last 20 years have plummeted, okay? So if we think we're creating serial killers, where are they? Because they're not committing crimes, okay? They're shooting people in your living room, but they're not shooting them on the street, which is what I had feared. So now teachers say kids who play video games are really hard to teach. And so I thought that was a really interesting comment, and I heard it so much that I started to investigate that. And people who study how memories are created say that when you learn something in a rush of adrenaline, it's encoded in a part of your brain that you can access really easily. And the reason is say our ancestors are like walking through a swamp, and they get to a deep part of the swamp, and an alligator reaches up and eats Ned, right in front of them, eats your uncle, right? And you're like, oh, better not go by that swamp again, right? Because and you remember it in a part of your brain, and that's why it evolved that way, because it was a protective thing that our ancestors needed. So our kids are learning a lot under adrenaline because someone's shooting at them, right? And they're about to die, right? So they're learning a lot under adrenaline. And then they go to school the next day, and the teacher's like, rah, 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 rah. And they're just like, right? Because their learning process is very heightened. And now teachers say, well, what am I supposed to do? And I say, shoot at them. You want them to remember it? Shoot at them. I don't know the answer to it. But I do know that there's a different mechanism of learning that happens. And I do know that it's becoming central in some classrooms. And in some classrooms, central in almost every part of the curriculum. So we've lost. They're going to be playing video games. It's probably not as bad as you think. And turn it off and make them read.
Our last question for the evening.
Thank you. My grandson is 5 years old. He is going to be 6 this month, and he's a big boy. They tested him, and he's reading 4th grade level, and he's comprehending what he's reading. My question is should we ask the school to promote him to maybe 1st or 2nd grade, or is it going to be harmful for him to stay in kindergarten? Because I'm afraid that he may become bored. And if he becomes bored, then he's going to lose his interest in school.
That's a really hard question to ask me, not knowing your son and not knowing your family environment. But I would say that your son's obviously very bright, and you want to obviously enrich that and keep feeding him and keep him moving forward. But the emotional development of a 1st grader or 2nd grader is very, very different than a kindergartner. And a child can be compliant, but it could be very, very stressful for him to be around a lot of older children. And I would think that if you skip him too far too fast, it could create a lot of stress for him in middle school, when the developmental differences between not just his male peers, but his female peers will be vast. So it's going to be a little bit of a high wire act for you. It's a great problem to have, but it's also something that's going to really need attention. And I would be cautious. Thanks. Listen, you know what? You've been a really fun audience, and I'm going to be in the back if you want to continue having the conversation. Happy to do it. Thank you.
Let's